Good afternoon, and welcome to today's GC3 Green Chemistry and Commerce Council webinar entitled Innovating with Intent, Science and Sustainability at Eastman. My name is Joel Tickner, and I'm the Director of the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is particularly important because of the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council's agenda to mainstream green chemistry. In December of last year, the GC3 released its agenda to mainstream green chemistry, which is the GC3's set of goals, strategies, and steps for innovation, research, and adoption of green chemistry. The GC3's agenda to mainstream green chemistry outlines a series of strategies to mainstream green chemistry, including enhancing market dynamics, supporting smart policies, fostering collaboration, informing the marketplace, and tracking progress. Today's webinar is particularly important because it highlights the challenges and the opportunities of bringing a green chemistry solution in the chemical industry into the marketplace and scaling it and moving adoption forward. For today's webinar, we have three speakers and actually more in the room from the Eastman Chemical Company. David Kossor is an associate toxicologist. Carol Perkins is an industry leader in the Industrial and Household Care Division at Eastman, and Mark Pavlin is a senior technical associate. David, Carol, and Mark are going to walk you through the steps from conception through design, application, and adoption of the Omnia solvent, an innovative new technology that Eastman developed for the solvent space. So with that, let me pass on to Carol and team at Eastman. Thank you so much for doing the webinar today.
Well, thank you this is Carol Perkins. Thank you to GC3 and also to everyone participating in the webinar today. First, a little about Eastman Chemical, headquartered in Kingsport, Tennessee, a global specialty chemical company, around 15,000 employees, serving customers across the world. A couple of things we're very proud of is our Energy Star Partner of the Year, Sustained Excellence Award for the 5th consecutive year, and the 2016 World's Most Ethical Companies for the 3rd consecutive year. So we're going to talk about green chemistry and development today, and we all want to make the world a better place, and we want to believe that most everyone else does, right? The journey we're about to walk you through will illustrate how rewarding and how difficult bringing a change as seemingly simple as a safer, cleaner to the marketplace can be. Innovation with intent, that's what we call this journey. It's really going out and instead of developing a side stream, a use for a side stream, or a new use for an existing product, we decided we were going to develop from scratch, from the ground up, the best product that we could, with safety being first and foremost. So why do this? You know, customers want innovative, differentiated end-use products, especially in the cleaners market. It's a very commoditized world where cost is king. So companies need a way to differentiate themselves. Of course, health, safety, and environmental benefits, a lot of changing regulatory requirements that we're all familiar with, and they're not going to go away. And then economic goals, both on the part of Eastman and chemical manufacturers and on the part of our customers. Why is this not done very often? Why do you not see a parade of new chemicals coming out on a daily, weekly, or even yearly basis? Well, first and foremost, it's very expensive to do this type of effort. We're talking, millions of dollars to do this. The timing is years. 2 years would be exceptionally fast. Typically, you're talking 2 years plus to bring a new chemical to market. A lot of regulatory hurdles, just getting on all the different chemical inventory lists, doing all the testing and the third-party requirements needed, and just the barrier to innovation within companies, because it's difficult to justify spending a lot of that money without a defined need that people say, yes, we're going to buy this. So our talk today will focus on 3 main areas: the decision to develop a new material, the process of developing and testing, and the commercial challenges of launching the safer chemical to the market. So let's start with the why do this, and we talked about that with the undertaking and the challenges. And why did we pick the cleaning market. Why pick the cleaning products market? This market was selected due to a lot of different forces pushing for change here. Lots of regulatory pressures on cleaners, lots of cost pressures. We heard from so many customers that it's the first cost to go. It's easy to just pick the lowest common denominator and the cheapest cleaner out there without regard for how safe it is or how effective it is. Of course, lots of safety concerns in the world today, both just from viruses and bacteria to protecting wildlife and the aquatic toxicity and the human health. Performance, we all know how important cleaners are to the world. Sometimes companies forget that use those. And of course, environmental concerns. So a lot of forces were brought together here that we thought was ripe for Eastman to make a difference in this world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Pavlin, and he's going to walk us through the development process of how do we develop a solvent for this market. Mark?
Thank you, Carol. Good day to you, Joel, and everyone online. When we're considering developing a new chemical compound for this application, which is aqueous cleaners, there are a number of selection pressures, and they're illustrated by this diagram. We're going to use, by the way, the word solvent instead of the word compound or ingredient or something. It's maybe not the best word to use in this context, but it's a convenient one, so we'll be using it throughout the slides. I'm going to step through these quickly, and I'll probably mention them again at some point. But the novel ingredient, this new kind of solvent, has a lot of things it has to do, and we're going to consider these. For example, what type of material should it be? And I'm talking now the chemical atoms that are used in its structure. We know, for example, that compounds or atoms like sulfur, phosphorus, and nitrogen are not things we're going to want to have in here. They tend to lead to high toxicity, poor odor, and so forth. How about the solvent performance? Well, of course it has to perform. It has to loosen grease, for example, or interact with soils to help clean the surface or the material that you're working with. We call this a coupling action. It has to be a material that works in water or with the surfactant, and also with the soil that you're trying to work with. Liquid properties are important. Perhaps not viscosity, because it's going to be a minor ingredient in the formulation, but its melting point obviously has to be below freezing. We can't have a solid, we have to have a liquid. The word solvent implies that it will evaporate, so its volatility properties are very important. That's related to its boiling point, if that's a more familiar term. It has to evaporate, and yet we want to develop low VOC products, so we really don't want it to evaporate. So what do you want? Evaporation? No evaporation. Of course, the health, safety, and environmental profile is very important. That goes without saying. And finally, the manufacturing feasibility. Well, in the end, we're going to have to make it. We're going to have to make it effectively, and we're going to have to make it in large volume. So where do we start? As Carol mentioned, we did not start with our existing portfolio of chemical compounds at Eastman. We didn't say, oh, I'm just going to see what Eastman makes and maybe offer this or that to the market. Rather, we just let our minds wander. We just said, what compounds are there? What could we possibly use? So we're starting from, if you will, scratch. Of course, we have selection criteria I just went over. We needed to construct a list of candidates. And right away, we knew that we were going to work with compounds that had an oxygen atom in there. I've already mentioned that we had to eliminate right off the bat anything with phosphorus, nitrogen, and sulfur. We knew hydrocarbons would not work. We needed to interact with water, so that limited our choice right off the bat to, for example, alcohols, esters, and ethers. Feasibility of manufacture. Well, we had to get our hands on these materials, so we had to worry about that, and we had to then prioritize our selections, and then we could get to work. So our initial screening would be guided by mathematical models. These allow us to do an assessment Now, this is going to be somewhat of a rough assessment. We can't do this with perfect accuracy, but it will allow us to eliminate materials and reduce the number of compounds we'd have to bring into the lab for testing. The two major models we used, one is for the environmental impact, an estimate of toxicity. It's called EpiWeb, estimation program developed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And then we also used a very familiar, at least to chemists, a very familiar calculation for the Hansen solubility parameter. This promises to guide our selection, that if we find materials that are good, we will then be able to find other materials that have similar solvent properties. So how are we going to start? How are we going to narrow the field? Well, this slide I call the big holes in the sieve. We're going to start with every imaginable compound we can think of. We don't want to eliminate anything at the start, but clearly we're going to have to limit this number. We started with just listing compounds, and that easily went over 2,000 right off the bat. However, many of these were, well, they're simply fantasies. Odd carbon structures, things that we recognize. There's just no way to get your hands on them. You can't purchase them. You couldn't even make them without a whole lot of effort. So we simply eliminated them. That brought us down to below 1,000 compounds. And then we said, well, can we get these materials at all? Can we synthesize them in the lab? Can we get our hands on them? Well, that eliminated some others. And so finally, then we came down to another big hole in the sieve, which was what kind of compound was it? That means, how does it interact with water? You'll probably be familiar that organic compounds can be protic, that is, they're alcohols, or they could be neutral or basic. And what we found with using our computer modeling tools was that it really looked like it had to be an alcohol, number one, to interact with water, and number two, it had to have a second oxygen atom. So we were therefore able to whittle our list down pretty quickly using our tools to materials that were alcohols. Well, now we've gone through the big holes in the sieve and eliminated a lot of compounds, but now we have to look at each and every compound in order to decide whether it would pass through what I call the fine holes in the sieve. So one by one, we look at each compound, look at its properties. For example, it may be a perfectly good compound, except it happens to be a solid. Clearly, that's no good. What about its volatility? Well, we knew right off the bat that we didn't want things that were really flammable, volatile, so we eliminated those, and so forth. Same with the environmental tox, and then, of course, the manufacturing feasibility, and so forth. So by going through each compound one by one, we were able to get our field narrowed down even further. This is illustrated by the next slide in schematic form. So we start with the universe of organic molecules, throw out the phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur compounds, come down to our candidate list, eliminate with the big hole sieve to about 600 candidates, go through to using the criteria discussed, and finally looking very carefully at each and every compound to decide which ones we really thought we could manufacture. That brings us down to a best candidate list. Understand, by the way, that it was possible at the beginning of this process, Carol, that we would find no compounds that would be left at the end of our fine sieve. We were actually quite happy that there were a number of compounds left at the end and looked very promising. So now we have to go on to synthesize these compounds, bring them in the lab, test them, and also evaluate their safety. With that, I'd like to hand over the talk to David Kossor, and he'll discuss the evaluation of the toxicity profile environmental of compounds.
Thanks a lot, Mark. It's a pleasure to participate in this webinar today. And as a toxicologist, it's been a pleasure working with this, playing a prominent role in this team where safety is a primary driver of development. Early on in the program, one of our earliest focus was to have the compound listed on the EPA's Design for Environment Safer Chemicals ingredient list. And Design for Environment, or DFE, is now called Safer Choice, and have it listed on the Safer Chemical ingredient list without qualifiers. And early on in the process, we identified a marvelous document that was presented by DFE called the solvent screen. And essentially, the solvent screen helped us to navigate through a variety of toxicology, and so we adopted that as our roadmap to help navigate through. So as shown on the bottom of the screen there, compounds can be categorized according to desirable or undesirable features, and it was our process to identify those that resided at the lower right part for low concern. And along with the process, we worked quite a bit with Tox Services, one of EPA's independent profile organizations, and they were extremely helpful in compiling literature and identifying similar compounds that could be used as read-across to fill some potential data gaps. So our program goals are to identify a safe and effective alternative solvent for cleaning formulations. And we did this by seeking acceptance from government regulatory bodies as well as NGOs to enable some of the third-party certifications in addition to DFE. And along with that, we sought to conserve time, costs, and use of research animals. And we did this by constructing a tiered strategy where we first looked at physical chemical properties, followed by computer modeling, and then in vitro testing, followed by limited animal testing. And some of the tools we used were the well-known 12 principles of green chemistry, the solvent screen, and the modeling programs. So we used the EPA's EpiSuite to model biodegradation, and also another program made available by EPA called their Toxicity Estimation Software Tool, which also goes by the acronym TEST, to model mutagenicity, acute oral LD50, and reproductive toxicity. What we then did, we subjected roughly the 70 or so compounds to this modeling and identified approximately the top 20, along with the physical chemical characterization, to subject to further tier 2 or in vitro testing to really corroborate some of the endpoints from modeling, particularly mutagenicity and biodegradation, but also to consider potential endocrine disruption. And we used the estrogen receptor transactivation assay to do that. And so we started the process anticipating running 20 or so compounds through. We essentially got through 5 or 6 compounds when it became pretty clear that there were 2 that were really very desirable. So we then decided to move those 2 on for further tier 3 testing for ecotox, for the acute tox, and eye skin irritation, skin sensitization. And then one of those 2 we then moved further into the 28-day repeat dose testing. And the results from this testing provided a pretty benign toxicology profile. And you can look down this list of findings, and I think it's pretty clear that there was very little seen. And so I'd like to make a few points about this. First off, the data from the acute tox testing. And these are LD50 values that were greater than the limit dose that was used. And the important point here is that we didn't lose a single rat with any of these tests. So these are also LD0 values. And another way of stating that, the LD50 is much, much greater than the limit doses that were used. So this is pretty remarkable. And in the 28-day repeat dose study that we did, we used a limit dose of 1,000 milligram per kilogram and saw no adverse effects. So, and really the only thing that we saw of concern was skin and eye irritation, and in the eye it was moderate, which led to classification under category 2 for the globally harmonized system of labeling. What's the significance of this? Well, as a toxicologist, I can say that safe is a four-letter word that we don't get to use very often. But in this case, it really does apply to Omnia. So we tested the doses up to practical limits and produced essentially no toxicity. And with respect to the eye irritation, that's a hazard that was observed with 100% solvent. And at the use conditions of 1 to 5% in a formulation, the risk is essentially absent. So that's the story on health and safety. And I'll now turn it back over to Carol Perkins, who will talk about product performance.
So now we have a proven safe solvent, meets all our early development and safety goals. And of course, now we have to show that it works. So we developed actually our own in-house test methods to show the chemical cleaning difference. Some of the standard test methods have a lot of mechanical action in them. They might have heat associated with them, and we really wanted to differentiate the performance of the solvent in the cleaning formulation. You'll see here on the left is our ugly little scrub machine, as we call it. It's it doesn't look very pretty, but it's very repeatable and very accurate in terms of removing soil from different substrates and being able to do it consistently. On the right-hand side, you see this is a vinyl composite tile with no wax. You'll see some of the other solvents that we selected to test against, some of the common solvents used in the industry. And you'll see Omnia in the middle. What we did is take that to 100% clean and then use the same number of scrubs for the other solvents. This is all in a formula. This particular formula has 2% solvent in it. And as you can see, the Omnia did better than any of the other solvents in this particular formula. And in many cases, it outperformed even traditional high and low pH cleaners. All of these were at neutral pH, which is what we think is the future of the cleaning industry, moving toward a more neutral cleaning performance. And we're showing that neutral pH can actually outperform high and low pH. If you look at the next one, this is the ASTM greasy soil. If any of you are familiar with making this soil, it is not fun. It's very difficult, very challenging, and very challenging to get it consistently right. But as you can see, we outperformed, once again, a lot of the common solvents used, especially in heavy-duty degreasers. We even conducted field trials. Apart from these little panels, we've conducted field trials in restaurants, and even a major one here on site cleaning locomotive engines with absolutely great results, and that was tested against a high pH formulation. Next, and this is somewhat unique to this type of chemistry, is a single solvent that will go after both the polar and non-polar soils. Traditionally, what you'll have is one solvent's really good with greasy soils, and another solvent is really good with some of the other kind of hard water stains and rusts and things like that. This little molecule, because of its unique structure, actually will go after both. And this is illustrated with the soap scum test. Once again, the soap scum is an ASTM test. And you'll see that Omnia actually outperformed a lot of the other ones, even at neutral pH. And one note here, our scientists were actually cleaning staff for the day at Bristol Motor Speedway as we were launching this product and scaling it up. And they were out there cleaning bathrooms after a major race. So it was a bathroom that over 100,000 people had used for the week. And they had a lot of fun doing it and noted that their PhD had gotten them a long way in this world. So we've checked all the boxes in terms of what this market needs to develop a new, innovative, safer, high-performance green cleaner. What do we do next? We found a partner to work with that's willing to help us move this forward. As you can see on this, even the economics were in our favor. We had proven that you could develop a formula that was equal and in some cases lower cost than the existing products. So we're pretty proud of this. We go out and find a perfect partner. It's a company actually in Chicago called Nyko Products. They were our alpha partner, as we like to refer to them, in the industrial and institutional cleaning market. Their team of formulators and their president, Bob Stahersky, was instrumental in really proving a value proposition on a commercial scale, not just in the lab, not just what Eastman thought, but what a company in this industry could actually do. They developed a line of really exceptional neutral pH safer cleaners that outperformed many of the traditional cleaners on the marketplace. They helped us with insight into the market and really helped Eastman understand the nuances of formulating cleaners. They were also committed, and that's key, they were committed to bringing safer cleaners to the market and using safer ingredients. And they were willing to make that investment to do so. As we all know, that's sometimes a tough sell to make that type of investment, but they were willing to do it. Our launch of Omnia was actually concurrent with Nyco's launch of their cleaners for the I&I market. So we went out with a bang. We had this great new molecule. They had these great new cleaners based on the molecule. And we launched with the pedigree needed to be successful, or so we thought, to change the world of cleaners. We'd listen to customers tell us over and over that they wanted safer products. We knew the trends and the regulations were in our favor. We sent hundreds of samples out, but wait a minute. Why weren't customers lining up to purchase Omnia? What was going on? Why were they not willing to change? We were struggling with that. Well, we got out in the marketplace after everyone told us they wanted safer ingredients. Then once push came to shove and we were ready with the molecule and we were saying, okay, let's go, people, we would hear these sighs, what we have is safe enough. And really, if what they were using wasn't banned, then change was difficult. The industry cleaning tests are subjective at best. A lot of them just make a formula and then throw it out and say, hey, customer, let me know if this cleans or not. So not a very scientific approach to cleaning, so it's difficult to differentiate. So we heard a lot, well, what we have is good enough. Good enough, safe enough, is there a good theme going on here? Well, Omnia is a new material. It doesn't follow the traditional rules of formulating, so it takes some effort. It's not that it's hard, it's just different. So it's not a drop-in replacement into their existing formulations. A lot of customers were coming off just reformulating due to the most recent carb rules. They didn't have a stomach for reformulating again. And then there's also the status quo. Well, you really need high or low pH to clean, which is what the industry believes in a lot of cases, but we were trying to prove that that's not necessarily the case. What we had, basically to sum it up, is simply a failure of the industry to achieve broad agreement on moving forward with this green chemistry and changing to a different model. One company within that whole value chain can't decide to do this and it be successful. An industry has to make that change, and they have to decide as a team and as a group to move forward. All stakeholders are going to have to embrace change, not just Eastman, not just a retailer. It's going to have to be everyone. Staying with the status quo is the easy, low risk, below the radar kind of answer that's just not acceptable anymore. We, as Eastman, we really never predicted the level of pushback we would get. I was being a bit altruistic. I thought I was going to change the world. So we said, okay, obviously we need to do more. We got out there. We did a lot of educational outreach, everything we could do to help that industry embrace change, formulation guidelines, lots of personal visits and demonstrations. We even hired the Bacon Boys, which is a food truck vendor in Las Vegas at the ISSA show last year, and they gave away hundreds of pounds of bacon to all the participants and gave live demonstrations on how to clean bacon grease with a neutral pH cleaner. In this case, we used the Nyco OM1 degreaser very successfully. And we got lots of oohs and ahs and, wow, this is so much better. But once again, changing those mindsets is very difficult. So a lot of lessons learned here. The better mousetrap argument stands, even with safer, more effective chemicals. Even because you got that better mousetrap doesn't mean it's going to get adopted. Now, the market's got to be willing to support manufacturers who really step up and invest in these types of innovations. Eastman stepped up without a guarantee that they were going to sell millions of pounds of this solvent. We made the investment to do this because it's the right thing to do. Regulations, both government and more recently the retailer regulations, they really play a critical role in adoption of safer ingredients. And unfortunately, a lot of companies won't change without them. And certainly change is harder than you hope and slower than you expect. As Joel said up front in his talk, we're trying to make green chemistry mainstream. It's just not quite there yet. So in summary, Mark might argue with me here, but inventing a new solvent is really the easiest part of the whole equation.
It's the most fun part.
It is the most fun, and it is the easiest. Doing that innovation to provide a proven new chemical that meets the needs of the market and will get adopted is really, that's the hardest part, because there's so many boxes you have to check, in terms of things you can check. You can check performance, you can check safety, you can check environmental, you can check regulatory, you can check economics. You can't overcome inertia in a lot of cases, and that was one of the hardest ones. Everyone needs to realize significant investment is required to bring a product to full commercialization, especially a new molecule. And in our opinion, all parts of the value chain, from manufacturers such as us, from formulators, retailers, even consumers, everyone must embrace and support change for it to really happen. With that, I will thank you for your time and attention, and I will turn it back over to Joel.
Thank you so much, Carol, Mark, and David. That was just a fascinating webinar. I think I would say that was one of the most interesting I've heard in the GC3 series about, the challenges faced of, we all believe in green chemistry, but how do we make it happen? In terms of addressing sustainability, much of the focus of the presentation was on toxicity. Did you look at also carbon footprint, resource use, et cetera, in your choices?
It was looked at, but by a different group.
Yeah. How did it fare in those criteria?
It was favorable, but didn't come out with essentially talking points to differentiate it from other products.
Great. So the real sustainability benefit was on the toxicity.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question is regarding the toxicity screening for the final chemical. What was done to evaluate carcinogenicity and neurotoxicity? These are called out specifically in the DFE criteria. What were the ways those were evaluated by Eastman?
Well, it was a weight of evidence, and there was really no suggestion that of any kind that it's had a potential liability to cause mutagenicity, genetic toxicity, or any kind of even epigenetic mechanisms, and also with read across to other molecules too. It's just, there's nothing on the radar screen that suggests looking further.
Another question is, as you were developing the solvent, you talked about, Carol, the partnership with the company in Chicago to formulate as a model to show it proof of concept. Did you also, in this sort of early stage, reach out to retailers and others in the green chemistry sort of leadership space to forge partnerships? Or what kinds of reactions did you get from the community in general as you were rolling this out?
We did reach out to a few of the major retailers and actually worked very closely with the EPA, with Clive Davies and his team at Safer Choice. As we went through this entire journey, early on we get lots of, yes, this is a great thing, we want to support your efforts, we're very happy that you're doing this. But once again, that level of inertia seemed to face us head on especially as we launched. So yes, we have reached out. We continue to reach out to retailers, to formulators, to a lot of the green chemistry community to try and spread the word and tell the story.
Another question regarding NICO. Is NICO still sort of a partner on Omnia, and how are they doing with these products?
Yes, they are still a partner. They're still a believer, and they have launched the products successfully across the United States in multiple markets. They're doing pretty well. I think Bob, if he was on the line, would say not as well as he had hoped, because the performance is so unbelievably great on these cleaners, we thought it would be a quicker adoption level. But he's still doing pretty well, and he's definitely still a partner, and he's looking at lots of new applications and new products using this molecule because of its power.
Right. Yeah, you had mentioned one of the barriers being a drop-in, it not being a drop-in. Based on this experience, would you rethink that idea that it, about it not being a drop-in, that if it if it requires reformulation changes, is it going to be a harder adoption, or should you just look in the future at drop-in molecules?
I think it's difficult to look at drop-in molecules in this market, because if you have a drop-in that's safe and then all the other ingredients are not, have you really gained anything? What we're trying to do is, as we say in our slogan, change the chemistry of cleaning. You don't need those high pH formulas to degrease. You don't need those acid-based formulas to clean your bathroom. You need to look at the big picture and look at the future, and I don't think we would change anything.
Good. No, that's a great answer. Here's a very specific question about functionality. Can Omnia be used in high pH or low pH formulations?
The answer is no, because it is an ester, as Mark pointed out, and at those pH levels it will tend to hydrolyze. Now, there are some caveats. You can go a little lower than neutral, a little higher than neutral with the right formulation, but not significantly.
Let me ask a question about your lessons learned. Right, it's there's a lot of lessons here. What would you do differently next time? If from the start, would there be things that you'd do earlier on to try and build the excitement about it? Would it be about building markets early? Would it be about building collaborations early? What lessons can we learn for the GC3 about mainstreaming green chemistry from this, this experience?
I think, companies like Eastman have to go into this accepting the challenge that it's going to be difficult, and that it's not a drop-in, it's not an easy just replacement, and the market for green chemistry is still in its infancy virtually. We've learned that change doesn't happen overnight, that you can do all the right things and still not meet your economic goals and targets, but you have to press on, you have to persevere. And I think in terms of helping other companies, I think they need to really understand, eyes wide open, and we're doing this for the long term, not for the short term gains.
Have you seen receptivity in what you might call the more forward-looking product brands versus the traditional ones in terms of acceptance or receptivity to Omnia?
I think the smaller brands have actually been much more receptive to making the change and going out with these innovative new products than the larger brands. Larger companies they're slower. It takes more time. There's a lot more approvals to go through, and smaller brands, they live and die by their brand too, and they're anxious in a lot of cases to launch green chemistry, especially one that's high performing like this. Yeah. There's a lot of skepticism in the market about green cleaners in general. One of the topics at one of the recent ISSA meetings was green does not clean, and there was a whole webinar on that actually. And what companies like Eastman, and there are others innovating in this market also, are attempting to do is make green clean and make it clean really well. So that's the difference.
Yeah. So a follow-up to that was, why did you choose NICO, an I&I formulator, versus a consumer products formulator as your sort of starting, proof of concept partner?
A couple reasons. Number one, solvents are used more extensively in the I&I market because it's just a more difficult environment for cleaning. So you just get a higher loading level of solvents in that market, number one. Number two, NICO is actually, they're not a huge company, but they have speed to market, they have good reach, they're very innovative, and were willing to put their money where their mouth was and invest with us to get these products on the market. So going with a bigger company, that was an option, but we wanted something that could get us on the market pretty quickly with a company that held the same values and goals that we did.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So let me sort of go upstream to Mark and David now. You talked about designing the molecule or choosing the molecules based on the 12 principles of green chemistry and the DFE criteria. Can you talk a little bit about how easy that was? I mean, the DFE criteria are quite well, outlined of, what the cutoffs are for different toxicity endpoints. The green chemistry principles are a little bit vaguer in terms of what that means to, do atom economy, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about how you integrated that into your choices?
Well, first of all, Joel, I started out by mentioning compounds that we were simply not going to consider. And I probably neglected to mention fluorocarbons or chlorocarbons. No chlorine, no fluorine. Not that I'm saying they're all bad for some reason or toxic. It's just they're more likely to be problematic. And we had a lot of compounds to think about. So we simply said at the start, there are some compounds that we're just not going to consider. That allowed us to focus on inherently safe materials. The nature is full of compounds that contain oxygen. Many of them are naturally occurring or very, very close to nature occurring molecules. So we gave ourselves the best shot from the start by constructing those. However, to be clear, we used manufacturing feasibility and some of the green chemical principles as parts of our screen, not to limit our choices at the start. We did by the atom compounds that we've put together, the chlorine, fluorine, nitrogen, sulfur that I mentioned, but otherwise we used those other principles only as a screen, especially toward the end, when we actually had a list of feasible compounds.
Great. And as you sort of did your screening, was it relatively easy to use the DFE criteria as design criteria and evaluation criteria?
It was more of a, I want to say in a general sense, to construct a paradigm within which to work, as opposed to something more specific where we would, the more specific guidance was really the solvent screen.
I think performance, physical properties are very important, and I think what I had in my mind at least were, as you go through these compounds and you look at them, you just know from experience that some are just not going to be easy to make, they're going to be wasteful, they're going to require special reagents that green chemical principles would tell me to stay away from. So there's it's sort of part of the overall screening. I don't specifically look at a compound and say, oh, I'm going to have to use an antimony catalyst to make that, so I'm eliminating it. I just know it. You just know you're not going to do that one because that one requires a bad catalyst, or that one requires a reagent that's going to be very difficult to handle in the wastewater system or something like that. It's sort of inherent. Every chemist should know this.
Right. You mentioned how you knew it. Did that come from, this is a side question, but important to mainstreaming, right? Is that something you learned through your education or something you learned on the job, right? Because one of the concerns is most chemists aren't trained to think about these things.
I certainly didn't learn it in my own education because I'm afraid I go back a few years, and those principles weren't espoused when I was going through my academic training. No, I think it's through long association with the industry and reading literature and participating in all the activities that the American Chemical Society are active in. So it's experience more than training.
Can you comment, I'm not sure who did the REACH registration, but someone asked about what the pre-registration under REACH was like. Was that, how did that compare to the PMN process?
Well, of course, it's more prescriptive. And I should say also that the focus for the potential market, at least in the early part of this, was North America. So our focus on Europe and other markets is something of a more recent development, and we're early on in that process.
Fantastic. So you had mentioned, Carol, some of the stakeholder engagement, including NGOs. it seems like there's a really important story to tell to the general, to those that care about chemicals, that care about cleaning products. How has Eastman tried to convey that message to sort of the more general public community? I mean, obviously you've presented at trade shows, you've been at the ACS Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference, but has there been broader sort of public outreach on this?
We've presented at numerous conferences, including the Consumer Specialty Products Association, the Southern Aerosol Technical Conference, and I'm actually presenting next month at the Industrial Research Institute, which has nothing to do with cleaners, but everything to do with the story of how this was developed and why it's important that companies embrace change like this. We've been to certain retailers, some of the bigger, large ones, and talked about this and actively tried to engage them in this. That's been our effort so far. Eastman is a B2B type company. We don't do advertising. We're not out there doing demonstrations in grocery stores. We're strictly B2B.
What's the response been from the retailers to Omnia?
Tepid at best.
So tepid in terms of not that interesting, or certainly many retailers have clearly noted the need for safer chemicals on the products that their customers buy. You haven't seen that uptake though, in terms of having a solvent that could be formulated into something that could be safer for consumers.
No, I'll be honest, we have not seen that uptake, and this is so different and so unique. And the great thing about it is you can have a green cleaner that can actually truly perform and perform well. And there are green cleaners on the market, even on the retail shelves right now, that they do okay, but we can help take it to that next level with this type of ingredient and with the correct formulation. But they're just, as I said in some of the challenges, what we have is good enough, what we have is safe enough. It just overcoming that lack of inertia is difficult.
Yeah. And as you said, cost-wise, parallel, right, with other solvents?
We look at it from a total formulation cost. And solvents vary anywhere from very cheap hydrocarbons up to some of the really expensive fluorocarbons and different things. So there's a wide spectrum of cost for solvents themselves. But you have to look at total formulation cost, and we've proven time and again that you can develop a formula with this ingredient that is cost neutral to a lot of the ones out on the market.
Great. Wonderful. Well, with this, we're reaching the hour. This has been an amazingly informative and thought-provoking webinar, and we hope to continue to engage with your team at Eastman in pulling out those lessons, trying to take those lessons and figure out, well, how do we mainstream green chemistry, and how do we build more Omnias that are successful, or build Omnias that are successful moving forward. We had several comments saying this should be written up as a case study somewhere for technical people, for business people, for policy people. Have you thought about that?
We haven't really thought about it, but that's a great suggestion. We'll take that suggestion to heart.
Yeah, something.
It is a great case study. I've been on this journey just about from the beginning, and it is a great case study, and we've learned a lot through the process. And in the end, I've thrown away every cleaner in my house, but the Nyko OM1 cleaners, I love those things. They're absolutely amazing, and I wouldn't go back. So we just have to get things like this in consumers' hands and end users' hands to help spread the word. That's kind of the bottom line.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Mark, Carol, and David, for just a fascinating webinar, and one that we look forward, obviously, to working with you, hopefully, on getting this story out there, because I think it's an important story about the opportunities and the challenges to green chemistry. Again, thank you so much for a great webinar, for your time and effort, and we look forward to future webinars. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.